Good day, and welcome to yet another one of our Brand Swiss weekly wraps. As per usual, we're going to cover basically what happened in the week and how it's going to affect you and your investments going forward. There were a couple of big topics this week, and not directly market related, but obviously we need to cover them because they're the biggest things happening in South Africa at the moment. There was the budget, there was that interview with the Andre Director, and finally, of course, there is the issue of greylisting. So let's start from this top, the budget. The budget was as good as could be expected given our current situation. I don't think that, if you had to look at where we were or where we are right now, you could realistically have hoped for a much better budget. There were no new taxes, which was important. There's no new VAT addition, and there were no new, basically addition of a thing like a wealth tax. So that was, I think, very important. I think the VAT issue would have been probably unlikely ahead of next year's election. But there was a possibility of more discussions about the wealth tax at the moment. I think that's something that's going to be just politically motivated. There's not going to be much revenue raised from it. It's not going to have a positive effect on economic growth in South Africa. To give you an idea of how bad it is, I mean, when France issued a wealth tax like over a decade ago, what we saw was, I think, about 40% of the high net worth individuals in the country left the country. We in South Africa might actually see something similar happen. At least it will be an incentive for more immigration from the country. Also in that budget was what was a reasonably fair addition to or adjustment to, for instance, the tax brackets as well as the the initial threshold for paying income tax in South Africa. The government used a 4.9% inflation rate, which is obviously lower than the current inflation rate, and is very optimistic for the next period. But it's better than nothing, and it's close enough to the real number, which is above 6% at the moment. That it's we're losing about 1% or so in terms of the brackets, and 1% or so in terms of the threshold, but it's not, as bad as it could have been. It's a reasonably good, adjustment coming through. There were smaller things like, for instance, the solar tax subsidy or the tax exemption or tax incentive for solar. For individuals, it's not huge. I mean, you're talking about dropping off like a quarter of your, taxes. Up to like a 15,000 limit basically, which is not a huge amount of money. You consider the fact that you'd be looking at something like a 60,000 rand solar panel installation would have tapped you out in terms of that allowance. And it doesn't, for instance, cover batteries and inverters. It's only the solar panels that they're looking at. It's much better for businesses. Businesses get a massive 125% rebate on that. So that's obviously an incentive for businesses to get much more self-sufficient when it comes to energy production via solar. But for individuals, it's nice to have, but it's not going to be a major shifter in terms of your decision to have solar or not to have solar. Because like I said, I mean, much of the cost of solar comes from batteries and inverters, and that's not going to be covered by this particular tax, incentive. We also saw Eskom's debt shifting onto the books of government. I told you that's what's going to happen. This is something I've been warning you guys for a few months now. That had to basically happen. Eskom is in dire straits. It's it really can't fulfill its mission. It really can't fulfill its its financial obligations, etc. It needs to have government intervene to a certain extent. Taking the stuff on government's books, it's more cosmetic than anything else because part of that debt was being backed by government anyway. It was effectively government debt in any way. But I think this is not going to be the end of it. As I've discussed before, businesses, people with money are shifting away from Eskom. Eskom is basically destroying any trust the customer base has in them. Solar is now at a point at which it's, comparable, in some cases even better than, getting electricity from the grid, especially because you can get the electricity without having to worry about things like load shedding, which means that, as time goes by and if Eskom ever does recover its ability to, get back on track, the culture of the economy is going to be around, you buy a house, the house should have some kind of solar if it's available. And that's going to be a really bad thing for Eskom because those that can buy houses with solar are usually the upper income earners that were subsidizing the lower income earners in the country. It's going to be the places of business that basically had more money available, capital available in order to implement solar. These are profitable businesses that tend to pay all their debts. And so we are going to find the cream of the crop of Eskom's customers basically being removed. Eskom's still going to have the obligation to provide electricity, especially around election time and going forward, where this kind of cultures and places where you don't pay for electricity, you kind of just tap into the power lines or whatever, or you just basically ignore Eskom's demands. That is going to continue because free is better than anything else. It's the cheapest price you can get, and so Eskom's going to be left with more and more demand and not much in terms of basically compensation for that demand that they're pushing out to the market, which is going to cause government to have to step in, probably again to take more of that debt onto their books. Probably bad for our fiscal situation, but that's just life. Speaking of Eskom, after one more last thing around the budget before you go out, if you're doing a lump sum, withdrawal when you retire, it's up by basically another 10%. Not much more changes happened that really affected you. There was nothing done to the tax-free incentive, etc. But if you are retiring, you have another 50,000 rands basically that's tax-free right now in terms of that lump sum withdrawal. So, getting on to Eskom, there's a massive controversy coming out because of under-directors' allegations against corruption at Eskom. Look, I'm sure you guys have all heard about it. If you haven't, go and watch that interview. I think it did on ETV. If it's still available, I think it might have been banned by ETV online, but there's plenty of stuff out there you can watch. Basically, what he's alleging is that there's government interference in Eskom, which we knew. Apparently, some that goes up to cabinet level, which we kind of suspected anyway. There's about 4 criminal organizations that operate there at Eskom, and basically they do things like damage plants. So the Eskom has to buy more stuff from the suppliers, who are basically the criminal organizations. They massively overcharge for things. He mentioned the fact that he has some knee pads that were going for a couple hundred rands that basically were charged 80,000 rands for. And when we had the guy arrested, the police let him out within a day or so. Again, corruption with the police involved as well. But the idea that we get from it is that Eskom, the issues are not just technical. They are not just building these plants. There is corruption internal to that organization that has to be rooted out. And until it's rooted out, there's nothing much the company can do. If we don't have, that corruption rooted out, no matter how much is spent on plants, no matter how much is spent on repair, no matter how much is spent on capacity, it'll just be siphoned off to these criminals. You build something new, the guy basically has a contract for building these things. He'll incentivize, he'll bribe somebody internal to the company to come break that thing so they have to buy it again. You have conveyor belt transporting coal. Hell, I have these trucks here. I'd rather have the trucks do this than your conveyor belt. Have somebody, damage conveyor belt, you have to pay for my trucks to use this thing. Those are the kind of issues we are seeing at Eskom right now, and that can't be solved until the crime is solved. And that finally brings us to greylisting. Okay. About a few months ago, last year sometime, I did a seminar on greylisting. If you're interested in bringing that up again, even though it's a few months old, the information is still valid. We covered greylisting. We covered what is going to be involved in greylisting and why. Basically, it's important for you to know what's going to be happening. So just email them, let's go to Ranswiss, and we'll probably send you that seminar with the slides, etc. if you need it. It was like an hour long. I don't have the time to go over it right now in full detail, but I can give you a little summary of what we talked about, as well as bring you some information for the most recent bit of news to light. So here's the thing. We are greylisted. What does greylisting mean? So there's basically, these are these lists that the thing called FATF has. FATF basically started off as an organization back about 20 years ago. It was meant to be a temporary organization, but over time, any bureaucracy grows in power. And what you found is that FATF has grown in power and become basically semi-permanent. Now, what this organization basically does is it tries to create almost like a walled garden inside which you can trust the participants. So the countries inside this particular walled garden, not greylisted, not blacklisted, can trust transactions between themselves. They can trust dealing between themselves quite easily. Anyone that does not follow the rules or is seen to be a bit of a dodgy place, they get pushed on what's called a grey list. So when you're dealing with the grey list, if you're in the white list countries, you kind of deal with more caution, let me say. So if someone's from the UK and the US, they're dealing with something, they both basically are not on this grey list or the blacklist. They can deal quite freely among themselves. You can trust the institutions in that country. You can trust the institutions in the other country. So, for instance, a bank in the US can trust a bank in the UK. A bank in the UK can trust a bank in the US in terms of verifying where things come from, where money flowed from, for making sure there's no money laundering, for making sure there's no illicit activity, etc. If a country basically does not follow the rules or the principles set out by FATF, it can be pushed onto the grey list. And when you're in a grey list, what happens is a bank in, say, like the UK or the US can look at a bank in South Africa and not fully trust that they've done the proper FICA, they've done the proper credit rating, proper background checks, etc. For clients. And that would mean that, there'd be a bit more of a hurdle transacting between the US and South Africa and back and forth. That is the kind of thing that we have here. There are, like I said, there's grey list and there's also blacklist. There's only a couple of blacklisted countries. There's places like North Korea and Iran. We're talking about not just the fact that they are, have lax systems, it's that, they are almost considered to be the enemies of the West, and the West is where this stuff comes from. FATF, that is. Now, South Africa has been placed on the grey list. What does that mean? That means that FATF has looked at our, reporting standards, our regulations, our rules, and so on, and found that they don't think that we are up to scratch when it comes to our reporting. Okay, some things they highlight is, for instance, the fact that finding beneficial owners of assets and companies, etc., in South Africa is not great. Remember, the FATF is trying to create a walled garden in which everything inside is clean. Okay. If you have a leakage in your system where money can enter the system and basically transact, etc., that money, if you're not on the grey list, can flow easily into that garden, that closed, clean garden, and contaminate it there. So what could happen is you could have drug money, you could have terrorist money, etc., flowing into the EU, flowing into the US, etc. If they interacted, clearly and easily with South Africa, and South Africa did not have the regulations in place. It's like you build a fence, but some places has a wall. Crooks can still coming through that wall. So the grey listing was done to South Africa because it's felt that our system has weaknesses that allow illicit money to flow into the system. And if they didn't have us on a grey list, that money could flow easily into the EU, into the US, etc. And that was not going to be seen to be positive. So that is what grey listing is about. It's the fact that we don't have the systems in place, we don't have the regulation in place to fully track where the money that we have is coming from, to know who owns that money, who's basically going to benefit from the money, etc. And it effectively allows criminals and other nefarious people to push money into the system, effectively clean it by having it in the normal banking system in the EU, the US, and those places, by entering the weak point in South Africa. Now, is that fair? Well, kind of. Our systems are not in place. I've spoken to compliance officers, etc. They say basically South Africa has taken a very tick box approach. They aren't really trying to, get to the root cause of problems. They just say, okay, this is a problem. Let's make a small rule, tick it, done, it's over. They aren't really following the principles behind it. That's one way. And the other way, I think it's also a little unfair because it's quite likely there's political motivations happening behind the scenes around this. South Africa is part of the BRICS. South Africa has relationships with places like Russia, which, if you look at whose countries are basically part of FATF, there's about 200 countries there, but primarily driven by the Western countries. There is a lot of animosity to Russia. There's a lot of animosity to some of the things that South Africa has done in the last couple of years. This could very well be a case of we've been punished economically for political decisions we have made. And one bit of proof around this is that a country like Pakistan, which is rife with corruption, there's many issues around Pakistan, around terrorism and other issues, and drug dealing and so on, was recently taken off the grey list. That's probably because it has strong alliances with China, it has strong alliances with the US as well, and strong alliances help it out of this particular jam. So the alliance with the US is, I think, very important to get out of the jam. Now, what can be done about this? Well, what we can do is change our rules, go and be reevaluated, and they can easily say, we've been reevaluated, we had these issues, we've closed the issues, back on the list, or back off the list. Is this possible? Yes. Countries have done it. I mentioned Pakistan, Mauritius has done it. I think Mauritius took 2 years to do it. A number of other countries have gotten off the grey list. We could do it in South Africa. But in all likelihood, this is a multi-year operation. It's 2 years, maybe 3 years for us to get off this list. Government right now is appealing for it to be reviewed in June, unless there's some political, machinations happening behind the scene, unless there's some kind of political push to help South Africa. This is not going to be done on purely economic or procedural reasons. We will expect basically this thing to continue for a couple more years. And why is this important to you? Like I said, what this does is it basically puts a bit of a taint on everyone from South Africa. We are grey-listed. That means we need to look at more caution. There needs to be more admin, more due diligence done on clients from South Africa and from a grey-listed country. Not to say our assets will be frozen, not to say our assets won't be able to get overseas and so on. All this does is it makes it more difficult to do that. You're going to need some help, more likely than not, to open accounts overseas, to invest overseas, etc. Because countries overseas that are not on the grey list are going to look at us and say, we don't want to bring this dirty money into our country because that might make us grey listed on the line. And that is going to be, I think, the main issue. We have to see what the full impact is going to be. We've already seen the rand weaken. I think the rand is partially weakened on this news, as well as, of course, stuff happening with the US inflation rate, etc. But I think the grey listing stuff is very important. And if you continue for, like, say, a decade or so, it's going to make a real impact on this economy. Fingers crossed we get out of this in a year or two. I think getting out of it in June is going to be very unlikely, unless, like I said, there's some serious political pressure. But I think if we do everything right and everything is fair, we're probably looking until about 2025 to get out of it. Okay, and if we're able to get out of it, we'll actually come out a stronger country, because what this will do is force us to have proper rules and regulations around dirty money, about beneficial ownership and those kind of things that'll make the financial system of South Africa much stronger. Corruption won't be as easy to achieve in South Africa if you can't put your billions into a bank account. You're not going to be get paid your billions to do whatever corruption you want to do and have that money just sitting in a pallet somewhere or in a bag somewhere. It has to go to the bank system basically for you to properly use it. You can't buy a house right now nowadays by cash. You can't buy an expensive car in cash in most places in the world. You have to use a bank account. And if you can't get that money into the bank account and you can't explain where the money comes from, etc., that's really going to, I think, prevent a lot of corruption. So fingers crossed that this actually turns out to be a positive in the long term for South Africa. But right now, what you're probably going to experience is trying to open an account, trying to move money and so on. There's going to be a few extra steps, a few extra loops to follow through. And also, government is probably going to be forced to enact more legislation to try and get us out of this grey list. That probably means more regulation about, knowing the beneficial owners of assets, more things about checking FICA and so on. So be prepared for a higher level of admin, I think, in the next couple of years, especially in offshore accounts. Okay. That's it for this week. Sorry about coming a bit late, but we will carry on with the normal, service by the end of this week. So there'll be a second one at the end of this week, a weekly wrap that is. Cheers, guys. Have a good day.